This is a picture of my arm. Is it a bug? No. It's actually a tick. And ticks are commonly lumped with insects, but the difference is it has an extra pair of legs because insects only have 6 legs. So to an entomologist, bugs are actually one small group, an order of insects, the Hemiptera, if you know the insect orders. They're not a huge order, but that's the true bugs to an entomologist. But to the public, all insects are bugs, and so not all bugs are insects, though. But for an entomologist, all bugs are insects, and not all insects are bugs. Are you confused? Yeah. Okay, let's go on. So as invertebrates, insects have an outer skin, or what we call an exoskeleton. If you step on a grasshopper or something, you hear that crunchy noise. That is their exoskeleton. They don't have internal bones, so it's a bit of a different body plan altogether. The main thing that insects are characterized by is 3 body regions. And if you see down here where my cursor is, the head, the middle region that has the flight apparatus, the wings and the legs, thorax, and then there's the abdomen where most of the digestive system and the reproductive organs are there. In addition, on the head, their eyes are what we call compound. They're multifaceted, lots of individual facets, which they don't have very sharp focused vision, but they're extremely sensitive to movement across their field of view. Their antennae are of various forms, but they are the insect nose. And of course, one thing that makes insects unique is the ability to fly. Spiders, by the way, have 2 body regions, and worms, as you probably know, like the segmented worms, have many segments. Okay, so as adults, insects also have 6 jointed legs that typically move in alternating tripods. So if you were to have a walking stick and let it walk across the front leg and the back leg on one side and the middle leg on the other forms a sort of a tripod, and that tripod alternates with this other tripod of the front, back, and middle of the other side as they walk along. So that's how they basically move when they walk. But more commonly, they fly. And insects can have typically 4 wings, but one group, the flies, this right here, have only 2 wings. But no other living group of animals has 4 wings. I mean, bats have 2 wings, birds have 2 wings. But if they've got 4 wings, like the moth here, or a wasp, or a bee, then it's got to be an insect. The other thing about insects is that they look very different at the different life stages. Of course, they go through their life cycle and they change as they go. And you've all heard probably of metamorphosis, starting as an egg, which when they hatch become a larva that look sometimes very different. This happens to be a lady beetle larva. And then when the larva grows from the very tiny egg, let me give you an example as a caterpillar, for example. The caterpillar will increase about 100 times its original weight when it first hatch before it's ready to change into a chrysalis or pupa. So they grow very rapidly, and imagine if humans grew at that rate, increasing our weight 100 times in 10 or 12 days, which is a typical life cycle in the summertime. And then the adults are the only stage with the wings, right here. And of course, the adults are concerned primarily with carrying on reproduction and producing the next generation. The other kind of metamorphosis, which is in the ones that we call true bugs and a few other groups of insects, is a simpler type in which the insect simply gets bigger and bigger as each stage progresses until it reaches the adult where it finally gets the wings. So it starts out and they all look a little bit like it without wings, and they just get larger. Sometimes the color change and so forth. That would be an example as a stink bug. So just to complete then our quick survey, when you look at the big picture of everything that's alive out there, here's the plants over here, about 18%, less than a quarter of all of life is plant life. But look at the vertebrates, which is what we are. We're only about 1% of all life. Then the insects follow. And from the beetles being the biggest group, uh, the flies, the next, wasps, butterflies, and moths, and then all other insects. So almost about 2/3 to 3/4 of the pie of life is made up of insects. They are a tremendously diverse group. And I know you can appreciate that. And they are important in the food webs of most ecosystems, even aquatic ecosystems. For example, I think it's curious that there's a mosquito right here that doesn't seem to come from anywhere, but that, of course, has its larval stages as a wiggler in ponds and water, even potted plants in your backyard. If there's a little standing water, it's, I'm told, but I've never done any experiments, that a single mosquito can develop in as little as a bottle cap full of water, which is pretty amazing. But anyway, plants are the basis of life, getting their energy from the sun, of course, through photosynthesis, and then they are fed on in turn by a whole host of herbivorous insects. And these are just a few examples: caterpillars, grasshoppers, aphids, grubs, and so forth. And then various predators go up the food chain or the food web, and ultimately you get to the top predators, which if you're an insect, it might be a dragonfly, but if you're in the birds, owls, and so forth. So they are significant components of the food webs in every ecosystem, with the exception of the marine ecosystem. Insects don't have any presence in the marine environment, of course. Oh, I put up a little picture. This was on my window the other night, right outside, and it was very actively foraging for little flies and moths that came to the light. That's a green tree frog, and it was doing pretty well. So there's another top predator. So spend a little time in your yard. I spent all day in my yard today, in fact, mostly weeding and picking things and just general stuff. But there's an amazing variety of plants in a typical yard. A lot of them seem to just appear out of nowhere, and they're called weeds. And there are also in those plants a lot more kinds of insects than you think there are. They have their own small world, and many of them are totally inconsequential. We don't notice them at all, really, in our daily lives. But then there are some, and that's the focus of this talk, that we call pests. But I want to just take a minute and show you a couple of things, pictures from my own garden. Very few cause harm, but here's a pair of damselflies. Can just about make them out. They're mating while they rest on a fence post, and it's what we call the wheel position. There's a male and a female, and I don't know if you ever see one of these. They often fly around in this position as well. But if they're resting, which is which sex? Because they're not actually hooked up in the way you think they should be when they're mating. I mean, the tail, I've lost my pointer, but the tail of one is holding onto the neck of the other, and the tail of the other is bending forward and connecting under the abdomen of the first one. It turns out that this guy is the male, okay? He's holding the female by the neck. She has bent her abdomen forward, and she is actually taking sperm that the male has previously ejaculated into a pouch here in this first abdominal segment. And so that is how she gets inseminated, is that he is first loaded himself, and then he catches a female, holds her by the neck. If she's receptive, she completes the wheel, and they can stay in this position for quite a while. So if you ever see males and females and dragonflies have the same basic system. So I thought you might find that interesting because there are a lot of bugs that aren't pests but are kind of fascinating. Now here's one that I saw back in April on my sidewalk. If you look closely, there's 4 of them there. One down here, one up here, one over here, and one over here. These are what we call lubber hoppers. Now they're something that is native to Florida. But some years ago, long before my time at UGA, someone released some in the Athens area, and I'm aware of 3 local populations, one in Five Points where I live, another one up in Normaltown, and another one out in the Whitehall area. And if you have them, the people in Five Points call them 5 Points stompers, and they rapidly get much larger. This morning. I found a couple of them when I was working in the yard, and that's a brand new adult. They don't fly, they do have short wings. And here, by putting my thumb under the wing, I show another little aspect of these guys, these 5 Point stompers. See the red there on the underside of their wings and the yellow stripe down the middle on a black pattern? They're very conspicuous insects, and that's another general rule about insects. If they're brightly colored, conspicuous, these lubbers are very slow moving. They don't make any effort really to get away. And the reason is they are inherently nasty to eat if you're a bird. So birds don't touch these things. Toads won't eat them because they contain some nasty toxic materials in their bodies, which make them pretty repulsive. And so birds learn very quickly to avoid them, and most animals won't touch them. But they are generalist predators all over my yard. I find them on every plant, and they're munching little holes in them as they grow. The other thing I wanted to share briefly, I run a flight intercept trap for insects in my yard. My special research love are wasps, things that sting. And these 2 little boxes show some of the wasps collected. You can more or less make out wasps up here in the top row, but some of these other ones are things that parasitize the eggs of other insects, and they're so small they have to be glued to a cardboard point, and then they're labeled. And I'm just interested in trying to get a handle on how much biodiversity in the wasps are in my backyard. And all of these specimens, I mount them and donate them to the University of Georgia collection of arthropods at the Georgia Natural History Museum, where I can study them and others, because, as I said, the wasps were one of the larger groups of insects, so it's impossible to know them all. But I'm always amazed at how much diversity, and I think you can sense how much is there. So what good are they? Well, besides being part of that food chain that I've already talked about, they are amazing recyclers of just about anything. This illustration is of a decaying log. It's infested first by bark beetles and graving beetles that get in under the bark, and then these long-horned wood-boring beetles with these legless larvae get in and bore holes right through the wood as they chew and feed. Then there are other things later on as it decomposes a little bit. Carpenter ants are attracted. Finally, you get termites. There's not probably a backyard in Athens that doesn't have termites somewhere. And then other organisms that decompose, the fungi come in and help. And eventually the wood is reduced to basically powder. Mushrooms and so forth help break it down further, and then it all puts it back into the soil. So they are recycling this over time, and that log lasts 3 to 5 years maybe before it starts to get punky. But there's a whole succession of insects in particular and other organisms that play a role. And this ecosystem service is something that a lot of people aren't aware of, perhaps, or at least take for granted. Similar picture could be shown if I had a dead animal. Carrion, for example, has a whole other suite of insects that come in early on, the flesh flies and so forth, and maggots. And the other one that comes to mind is dung, cattle dung, for example. There's another suite of insects, dung beetles in particular, that roll away balls of dung and bury it, and again, recycle that material. So there's a lot of things that insects are useful for, besides the fact that they are often as a bit of a pest too. Of course, the one thing that most people mention when you ask what they're good for is pollination. This is a picture of the bees. We probably have uh, maybe 1,800 to 2,000 kinds of bees in Georgia. Uh, Most are solitary. You seldom notice they're nesting in the soil, they're nesting in hollow twigs. The one that everyone and gets all of the media attention, of course, is the honeybee. And in case you haven't spotted the honeybee, I'm going to circle it right now. It's right here. And it is a very important pollinator, been much maligned with people's use of pesticides, for example, but this colony collapse thing has been much in the news over the last few years. The numbers have declined some, but bear in mind that before we had honeybees, and honeybees are not native, they were introduced way back in the 1600s. The Indians called them the white man's fly, but they're from Southeast Asia originally. But before we had honeybees, we had all these other solitary bees. And somewhere on here is a squash bee, for example. My squash are pollinated primarily by the group of squash bees, which are, I don't know where they're nesting in my neighborhood, but they look something like this guy right here. And then the other bee that we see a lot of is way over here, the big carpenter bee. And I'll just take this moment to mention that on August 21st and 22nd, the Georgia pollinator census will take place. And this is the second year of it. It's open to anybody who wants to participate. You simply go online, and I think Laura will have the information on that at the end of the presentation, or be sending it out to those of you who are listening. The census was fun. It's basically all you do is find a patch of something flowering in your yard, like this patch of milkweed, and you sit there and you count the number of pollinators and do your best to identify them. So if you look way down in the lower left corner here, on this milkweed is a carpenter bee. And here's another critter over on this one, and there's another critter way up here. So even in just a snapshot of the milkweed, which is a very good insect or plant for pollinator. I think there's maybe something over here. Does it look like a butterfly? Lots of stuff. And so for, I think it's like 15 minutes, you make a count and you estimate what you've got: small bees, large bees, honeybees, butterflies, etc., flies, all the things that are visiting. And then that gets put into a statewide database. So look for that. And if you're inclined, have a little fun. It's not hard, and it is contributing to sort of getting a lot of baseline data on the abundance of pollinators. In fact, though, some pollinators aren't as welcome as others. Now, this is a favorite spring activity of a good friend of ours. Most of us know this insect because they are one of the most common spring insects, beginning in mid-March, typically here in Athens. Carpenter bees flying around our buildings. And they tend to hover in front of you and look at you. And so if you're the sporting type, one way to take them out is with a badminton racket. But just a little bit of their biology. This is what you might see if you look up around your buildings. A little hole with some spattered sawdust raining out it, or a pile of sawdust below. And if you look up under, there would be a little hole about a ½ inch in diameter. And if you spend a little time watching, you'll soon see the culprit that's made that sawdust pile and the hole. And it is a carpenter bee, well named, because they have very powerful jaws and can chew into solid wood. And they make holes a little bit bigger than a pencil, very typical. And they are on the wing well, they're still on the wing. As I showed you in that picture of the milkweed, which was taken here just a few days ago, that had carpenter bees on it foraging for pollen for their babies, just like honeybees. If you could go inside of the nest, inside, say, the 2x4 under your porch deck, the entrance leads to a tunnel. They very soon after they enter the wood, turn and move with the grain of the wood and make a very long tunnel. And when they get to the end, then they start to provision it with pollen, and the egg is laid, hatches, becomes a larva, that whole life cycle, and then forms a pupa. And each of the compartments in this long tunnel is walled off as it is made, and a baby bee develops. And these adult bees actually emerge in late July, August, and are around in the fall, and then they overwinter as adults in these tunnels. And that's why we see them so early in the spring, is that they have overwintered as adults. So the first warm days bring them out. Now just a bit more, they're often confused with bumblebees. They look a lot like a bumblebee, but here's the basic difference. What I like to look at is the head. Carpenter bees, because of those draws to chew wood, have a large head that contains the musculature to work those jaws. So bumblebees, if you look at them, have a pinhead, very triangular and small. But more importantly and easier to see is the abdomen. On carpenter bees, it's bare and shiny black. On bumblebees, there's always a bit of furriness and yellow, typically. We have several species of native bumblebees, but none of the bumblebees have a bare back like the carpenter bee. So when you see the two of them on your flowers, and they're both out now, very commonly, that's how you quickly can distinguish them. All right, there's the other aspect of the carpenter bees that I wanted to mention. The ones you see in the spring primarily are males, because the males are looking for mating opportunities with females who are looking for places to nest. And it's very easy to tell a male. If it's a yellow, it's a fellow, right over here. Yellow, it's a fellow. If it's black, keep your space. You don't really need to worry, however. As I said, these are solitary. And even though females do have a sting, they aren't aggressive, and they aren't going to be protecting their nest like a honeybee or a yellow jacket. But it's these guys that typically hover in front of you. And if you just stand for a second and let one hover, it's very easy to see that very conspicuous yellow face of the male. So yellow, it's a fellow, and it's males do not have stings in any bee or wasp. It's only the females, only the girls that sting anyway. And it's only the females that make the nest. Now, if you're really fastidious and I won't say, one way to reduce the population of the bees is, if you find their holes, simply take some putty or wood filler here, and at night, because the females spend the night in their burrows, if you caulk it or putty it up and plug it, then you have ended that female, because they cannot chew out from inside. They can only chew in from the outside. And then I wanted to also share something that's worked very well for us, is a carpenter bee trap, which I've now seen them at places like the big box stores and even others locally, Koffers. All it is a little wooden box with a 1/2-inch hole, and the hole is sloped slightly uphill, and a glass jar is attached to the bottom, and that glass jar has a hole through. So what happens is carpenter bees are always investigating potential nest sites in wood. So you hang this in areas around buildings. They will enter, and in fact, both males and females enter, but we're primarily trying to get rid of the females, since they're the ones who make the nests and produce the new offspring populations. And once they're in there, they can't find their way back out easily, but like most insects, they're attracted to the light. So there's a big hole in the bottom that leads to the jar, and it's light in the jar. They go down in the jar, and eventually they die. You don't have to put any chemicals or anything in there. It's a non-attractant way of dispatching a fair number of carpenter bees, if that is something that you're anxious to do and don't want to go around and plug holes, or maybe you do both. So anyway, that's just a little bit on carpenter bees. So I haven't talked much about garden insects. We need to go ahead and get in, but the one garden and yard insect that's very conspicuous outside now at dusk are lightning flies, or lightning bugs, or fireflies. and they're pretty magical insects. Here's a close-up of one. The light is a uh, cold light chemical that is luciferin, and luciferase causes it to glow bright. And we see these flying about our lawns in the summer. And I just want to share a little bit about what's going on, because there's a little intrigue here as well. First of all, there are many kinds of them. This chart shows the flash patterns. If you were to track an individual over several seconds, like 15 or 20 or 30 seconds, you'll see it flying through the habitat. So the one I want to focus on, the one that's our common inhabitant, take it down to the laser pointer here, is this guy. Okay, so here he comes. He flies, turns on his light, goes down and makes a little J, flies a little further, makes a little J, with his light on, flies with no light on. He's going down, starts at the bottom of the J and goes up. And he flies a little further and so forth. So it's number 8. This is Photinus pyralis. It's our common lawn species in the area. But there are some that fly typically quite high and just make a series of flashes, blip, 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 and then goes off, and then blip, 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 go off, and so forth. There are others that make a regular blip, blip, and fly a little bit lower through the vegetation. But we're just sitting on the front porch with a cocktail or whatever your favorite beverage is, and watching these at dusk can be quite illuminating. I've even been successfully able to mimic a firefly and attract them, because what these are the guys. Only the guys are out there flying. They're out there saying, hey, I'm sexy, I'm ready, I'm able, over. They fly a little further and repeat the message. Females are nestled down in the grass where you don't see them. But if they see a male of their species, they respond with a coy, short flash. And that's what I've been able to do. There's a slight delay, maybe a second or 2-second delay. I can sit there on the porch with my pen light and sheltered in my hand, and if I see a J-shaped male anywhere within a few feet of me, and I do one quick flash after he does his, he may circle and repeat his J, and then I repeat the response, and he may circle a little closer, I repeat the response, and I've actually been able to get one to land on my thumb, thinking I was a female. It's a fun challenge. I won't guarantee that it'll work, but that's what's going on. It's a signaling system, and it's a visual communication system. Very cute. And let me get rid of the laser pointer now. And one other bit that's going on that you won't be as aware of is that there are some bad guys in the firefly world, which are females called Femmes Fatales, who mimic the flash of males. So they may they don't mimic the male's flash, they mimic the female. They respond to the male's flash by flashing back at him. And so they attract, and it turns out that this girl is a different genus, very different, totally unrelated to the one that made the flash. This is the male. She attracted him to her like I did with the pen light, and instead of mating, unfortunately, he becomes lunch or dinner. And so the Femmes Fatales are quite a drama that's going on right in our yard every night of the year, or every night of the summer here, especially in July. Okay. A lot of folks out there in the public think the only good bug is a dead bug. And pesticides, if you go to the big box store, there are shelves and shelves of products that you can use to kill insects. And I'm not denying that they have their place. But they are a bit of a mixed blessing. I found this online, an old ad for DDT, which was, of course, the miracle silver bullet insecticide that was developed in World War II. And the troops in the trenches in Italy and Europe and so forth were powdered with DDT to control lice in particular. And it was a miracle because it was very, very effective. and then it was made into sprays. You spray it on the wall, anything that lands on the wall. The thing about DDT and other organophosphate pesticides is that they have a long persistence in the environment. So they continue to kill for years in some cases. For example, houses built before the 70s all were treated in the foundation stage with malathion or similar products, which persist for 20, 30 years and keep the termites at bay. Nowadays, there are other products which have replaced those long persistent ones. But I want to say a few words, even though it's still the traditional mindset. In a lot of neighborhoods, you can probably point to them in your own subdivision. Beautiful green grass yard, totally free of anything, practically no flowers, no weedy plants. And for some, that's what they want. They don't want any kind of insect. Better living through chemistry. Agriculture, chemicals are used widely still. They reign, no pun intended. But you may be aware that this is cause of a second problem that has gotten widespread publicity in the past, starting way back with Rachel Carson. But it's what we now call, or is called, the pesticide treadmill. Let's say you're growing potatoes and you get potato beetles on it, and you don't want to, you want the crop, the potatoes are underground, but the beetles are eating the leaves. So you get a pesticide, you develop it, you go out and you apply it on the pesticide, the pests are killed. But the phenomenon that became very apparent very soon after DDT was introduced was that of resistance. Insects, because of their rapid life cycle, their genetic variety, some genes mutate, and some of those mutations were favorable to make them survive against pesticide assault. And so then you apply that pesticide the next time they come in on your potatoes and you don't get any control. What do? Well, what the industry does is then they've gone back to the lab, they develop a new pesticide, and the cycle repeats. So you're on this treadmill. But going back, sorry, the simple approach for our purposes tonight is to just say we got good bugs and bad bugs. It's a little bit subjective, but it kind of helps me to categorize where we're at here. So let's now I was going to ask Laura if this brochure is available anymore. It's a one that has good garden bugs in the southeast on one side and bad garden bugs in the southeast on the other side. And if it is available, it's a very handy chart that will allow you to identify almost anything.
Yeah, Bob, I know we had one of those in our old office before the move. I'm sure we still have it, but we didn't have many, and it really is a great one. It was me and Joanna's favorite little reference. So what we might be able to do is get a PDF of it at least and send that out in a follow-up email. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I think if people had access to it, that because the first question is, what is it? And this is a quick way to begin to get the answer if it's totally unfamiliar to you. So I just wanted to draw that to your attention. So the bad bugs are the ones that feed on plants and animals and us. And the good bugs are, of course, as I mentioned, pollinators, predators, and those wasps that I love, the parasitics that feed on the bad bug populations. And then the other thing about bad and good bugs is that bad bugs tend to be gregarious. They tend to cluster. They tend to be plant oriented on particular plants, like the potato beetles, for example, or aphids. The good bugs tend to be more loners. You don't see large numbers of them, but they're out there. As my insect flight trap demonstrates, they're out there and they're playing major roles keeping the bad populations in check. So if you don't have that little sheet of good bugs and bad bugs, of course, there's always the internet, or there are books out there. And it's the adult stage that is the one that is most readily identified and most often noticed, and most identification is based on the adult stage. So who is responsible for the damage that you see? There's two pictures here. I've got a picture of an azalea leaf that is not looking very happy. And over here, I'm not quite sure whether this is a radish maybe, or maybe it's a collard or cabbage, but it doesn't matter. It's got some kind of something that's chewing on it. This one is less obvious on the bottom, but you look for patterns, and you're trying to also be aware that, of course, there can be environmental causes, such as maybe not proper fertilization or soil pH. There can be diseases that cause, like fungi that cause blights and so forth. So you try to rule out those, but if you've got holes in leaves, chances are you've got an insect. So here's a quick case study from my garden. Squash. I went out one day and discovered that part of my leaves were missing in this lovely pattern. And then, so you turn the leaves over and you see if you can find the culprit, because often you will. And by golly, when I looked around through my squash, I found everything. I found eggs here in the middle. I found larvae, and I found adult, the squash beetle. And it wasn't very hard to go online or go to one of my books and identify it as a squash beetle. And it's somewhat related actually to lady beetles, but this one is not a beneficial. This is one that eats squash, cucumbers, and similar plants. Okay. There are lots of online identification resources, and this is just one. I mentioned it specifically because it was developed by a professor in ecology here at Georgia, discoverlife.org, and it's very user-friendly. If you click on that and go to it, I think maybe I had a list of these on a handout. Did I send that to you, Laura?
Yep, we've got those. That's something else that we can send out in the post-class email. So we'll talk about that.
If people are interested, there's 5 or 6 different online resources that I found to be useful. They cover different ways of identifying. So and answering that first question, what is it? So that would be great if people find that useful. Feel free to look them up. So as I say, there it gives me the name, common name, and its genus and species. If I'm, as an entomologist, I'm kind of interested in that part too, but that's less interesting to the public. So not all ladybug types are necessarily good, but this one is an example. The university also has a printed extension bulletin published back in 2017, which I think is available. There's a representative sheet here on the right from one of the pages in there. Again, helps you answer that question, what is it, which then can tell you what you might need to do about it. So you're going to identify the adults, but as you saw from my squash insect, it's the caterpillar, or actually the larval stage, that have the appetites and do most of the damage. So let's look at a few categories of bad bugs in our yards and gardens by how and when they attack. And the first group I want to focus on are things that live in the soil that are not commonly seen, but the damage is done. Soil pests, the little white grubs, if you spade up your garden, you often see these. They're C-shaped, about half, 3/4 inch long. These are feeding primarily on roots, but they become beetles. There's also some other things. Here's a life cycle in this shot, showing larva, which feeds on the roots of a lot of plants, and then it forms a pupa down in the dirt. And as it emerges, this happens to be a Japanese beetle, which then goes up and feeds on the foliage and lays its eggs back in the soil, and the life cycle continues next year. The second kind of soil insect that you're not as aware of are cutworms. And they get that name because they literally come up and they like to cut off seedling plants. So if you've just transplanted a bunch of seedlings in your fresh garden, the stems, you may come out the next morning and find several of them toppled, and you won't see the critter, but he was there, or it was there in the night and chewed across, and that's how it's getting some of its food. And these things go back in the soil, pupate, and become sort of a nondescript brown moth. Second category are foliage chewers. which we've already mentioned with the leaf beetle, but here's another one that's very ubiquitous in my garden every year, this velvet green caterpillar. And it is on anything that is a cabbage or relative, kale, kohlrabi, radish, uh, Brussels sprouts, broccoli. All of these are infested and infected by the cabbage white butterfly. And the butterfly you'll see flitting around your garden, it deposits eggs individually on the underside of a leaf. So if you see one land on a leaf of one of your cabbage plants or your broccoli plants and sort of curve its abdomen around underneath, it's usually a female depositing an egg. And that egg quickly hatches and over 10 days does a lot of damage to the young leaves of your plant. And it grows to be about an inch, inch and a half long green caterpillar. And they become this butterfly, but it's not one of the good guys. I've already mentioned the Japanese beetles. They are widespread right now. In fact, my gardens have had Japanese beetles just about every year, and they skeletonize the leaves. At the moment, they're the biggest problem on my beans. They typically are up on the higher parts of the bean plant, and very typically they're mating while they're eating. Typically there'll be a pair of them mating and eating as they go. Now, a quick way without pesticides to deal with these, if you don't have too many plants and they're localized on just one or two kinds of plants, is to make a pan or a container of sudsy water. And then like if you've got a pot with soapy water in it, and you carefully position it below the plant where the beetles are, and then you just tap the plant or tap the beetles, they almost instantly drop to the ground if you do that. So if you disturb them before you're ready to catch them, they're all going to be dropped to the ground. But if you wait and get a pan of soapy water and put that under them, tap them, they'll drop into it. And you'll get a surprising number in a very short order. We have them not only on our beans, but on our roses. And my wife did this the other day, and she had quite a pile of them just off of the rose bushes in our yard. And that definitely keeps them from laying eggs when you've captured the adults and put them in the oil, in the soapy water. And it's a fairly low-tech, inexpensive way to deal with something that's fairly common. Now, the big box stores also sell another trap designed to trap Japanese beetles. And I've run these as well, and it's very effective, but it's a totally different approach. But it's one that works for lots of insects, not just these, but it's very specific, and that is a pheromone trap. On this yellow panel is impregnated the sex attractant odor, and both sexes will come in and they hit that panel, and it causes them, there's nothing to grab onto, but they're attracted to the odor thinking it's the opposite sex. They hit the panel, they fall into that little funnel and end up in the bag in the bottom. And if you're out in the sun for a while in a bag, you're going to cook. And anyway, they can't crawl back up. The plastic is kind of slippery. So actually, it's quite surprising how many you do get. The thing is this attracts from fair distance away. So you might want to consider whether you want one in your yard, because you're attracting beetles to your yard from the whole immediate neighbor's area. But they will go to that trap, and it definitely does a good job. But if you're just getting rid of those that are on your plants and don't want a chance getting more in, then consider using the soapy water method. All right, here's another one that's common in my garden. Almost every year I find these guys on my tomatoes. It's called the tomato hornworm caterpillar. And the reason it's called the hornworm, it's not very obvious, but there's a little horn right here above the top of the tail that sticks out. Now, they're a large caterpillar about the size of your little finger, and you're suddenly aware that a lot of your plant foliage has been gone missing overnight. And if you just look around in the other parts of the plant, you may well find the culprit, which is this caterpillar, the tomato hornworm. It becomes a large moth, a spotted hawkmoth. There it is. And you sometimes see these at light at night. The other thing, though, about these gets back to my love. A lot of times Extension gets reports or questions from homeowners who see tomato hornworms with these white, what they call typically eggs. Well, no, that's not eggs. That white structures that are all over the back of the hornworm are cocoons. They are cocoons of a parasitoid wasp. The caterpillar has been the host. A week or so earlier, the female parasitoid wasp stung the caterpillar, laid some eggs inside the caterpillar's body. The eggs hatched, became maggots or larvae, and they basically ate all of the fatty tissue and everything that wasn't vital to keeping the caterpillar alive. So it's basically a hollow shell with just a few muscles and nerves left now inside. And when they've all fed up, all of these babies chew through the skin, and the caterpillar is still quite alive and able to crawl. And they spin their little cocoons on the surface of the caterpillar. And so if you put the caterpillar in a jar, just to satisfy your curiosity, about a week later, week to 10 days, you'll have a jar full of little black wasps. And the wasps are quarter-inch long. And those are natural biological controls of tomato hornworms. But don't call those cocoons eggs, because they are the pupal stage of a parasitoid wasp. So there's a little more natural history for your garden. Another pest, borers. Right now I'm battling the annual battle with squash vine borers. And these are, again, a moth that lays its eggs on the vine down near the ground, where the plant goes into the soil. And the caterpillar bores into the vine and hollows it out. And your first sign is a wilted end of the plant a day or two later. And about all you can do is cut off the infected part and hope that there's some left that you can root. They're very difficult because they're inside of the stem of the vine to control chemically, but it's easy to cut them out. And if you do cut them off and just kind of peel back the stem of the squash vine, you'll usually find a yellow grub in there. They're fairly sizable, and they grow. Well, there's the damage, and they grow into a very attractive day-flying moth, kind of a tiger moth. Well, it's not a tiger moth, but it's related to what I call tiger moth. But they're red and black, good bulldog colors, like the 5-point stomper, red and black. Okay, so borers, squash vine borers, big problem, and they have some natural enemies, but not as obvious ones like the tomato hornworm does. So the best control I've found is to monitor my plants and quickly remove infected stems. The interesting thing is that if you're growing winter squash instead of summer squash like zucchini, the winter squash, like butternut, for example, have a solid stem instead of a kind of a hollow, soft stem. And these guys don't attack the winter squash and the butternut squash. And so you're safer growing them. Now, a few other kinds of borers out there. If you're growing any kind of fruit trees and hoping to get plums, pears, apples, you may have problems with a seldom seen insect called the plum curculio. It's a snout beetle. You can kind of see the snout here, right here on its head, and the jaws are right down at the tip of the snout. And what they do is that they chew on the surface of fruits, uglifying them, leaving fairly characteristic markings, and it damages them. And a single beetle can damage quite a few. Well, they will lay their eggs and complete their life cycles and be back next year as well. Sprays work pretty well on these guys if you're getting them when the adults are active, which again is midsummer. So they have complete metamorphosis. The other borer that I've seen regularly, especially if I'm trying to grow peaches, the characteristic of it on my peach trees is some gummy goo oozing out, usually near the base of the plant. Here you see a couple patches of it. And that's because this borer is the larva of this moth. It's a clear wing, day flying moth, lays its eggs around the trunks in cracks and crevices. They quickly hatch and begin to bore in, and the tree responds by producing all of this excess sappy, sticky material to try to push the larva out. And sometimes it is successful if the tree is in good shape. But if it's got several larvae attacking it, the tree could be a goner. So those are something, some systemic insecticides that the tree takes up from the roots may be effective. Again, there are recommendations in that extension bulletin if you want to get more specific on this. Another one that is a borer that is very interesting, if it hasn't rained for a couple of days and you've got a little infestation, you have these sawdust toothpicks, which are crazy to see coming out of your plants. This happens to be a fig in my yard again that I lost to this, an ambrosia beetle, called ambrosia beetle because ambrosia is a kind of a fungus that these beetles carry. They're a tiny little bark beetle-sized insect that are attracted to any of a variety of hardwood plants, not coniferous plants, and they chew right in. And as they chew in, behind them, out comes this frassy toothpick. What they're doing when they chew in, when they get in a ways, is they inoculate the vascular system of the plant with a fungus that then spreads throughout the vascular system and kills the plant. And that fungus is the ambrosia. But those toothpicks are diagnostic. Now, I will say that this one is something you have to worry about more in the spring, early spring, before the leaves come out even. Although there is a small second generation that's starting to come out now. But the main problems in the Athens area seem to be in the early spring, but the extension people may want to correct me on that. But here's what the again, a homemade trap that works quite effectively. And I, in February, have made 3 or 4 of these from 2-liter soda bottles, cutting out a window and leaving the cap on. And in the bottom, I fill it with that now very precious material, hand sanitizer, which is basically 70% alcohol. And it turns out that the ambrosia beetle sex attractant is ethanol. And so they come flying thinking this is a tree or other beetles. They hit the back of this and they fall down and they get stuck in the gooey hand sanitizer. And you've got a bunch of them in there. And it has been quite effective, although I don't know that it'll completely stop infestations because they produce large populations of these guys flying. And this was in mid-February. There's my version, and there's a catch after I ran it through a strainer and washed it in under my kitchen faucet. The bark beetles are right here, these 4 or 5 were the ambrosia beetles, and there are several other kinds of things that either were attracted for some reason or just bumbled in there. There they are, circled. Okay, the next group of insects to cover briefly are sucking insects. They are ubiquitous, and there's several kinds. Aphids are one of the most common, and they are wingless, and typically they are highly gregarious, so that all of these little orange things are a population of aphids that literally grows overnight. A single foundress female lands on the plant and starts laying babies. They produce parthenogenetically, and this picture shows basically each aphid on there is an expectant grandparent. Here's a baby coming out while she's got her beak plugged into the vascular system, sucking the juices out of the plant. And they secrete out of these little structures right here. These are called cornicles. They produce little droplets of sugar water. I'm sorry. They do. Yeah, they produce droplets, but it's these droplets are what get on your car windshields of sugar waters, a little sticky. You get on and you find that you've been parked under a tree or something that has a population of aphids that you weren't aware of, and your windshield is covered with little specks. And of course, on the plants, these droplets accumulate on the lower leaves below the infestation and very quickly become fertile ground for other kinds of things like fungi, and the plant looks pretty terrible. Again, these are very susceptible to a lot of pesticides, and again, that extension bulletin has suggestions. Another group are white flies that, in our experience, are more common on plants that we bring into the sun porch in the wintertime, but they're also out there in the summer. And both aphids and white flies that look a little bit like a tiny moth, it's a little hard to tell, but they're kind of fuzzy, and they are gregarious. But they're often also a problem because some species carry various plant viruses and other diseases of plants. So a double whammy if you get these possibly. So be aware, again, if you see problems on your plant, turn it over and you see something like that, you've got white flies or mealybugs. There's another resource that Laura probably will share with you, is the Georgia Pest Management Handbook that is produced every year. It's a much more encyclopedic volume for a lot of the growers and so forth, but there's a lot of information in this. For example, here is a table in there showing home insect vegetable and the control, etc. So again, resources are out there for you to become knowledgeable about the critters that you find, and first, as I said, was identifying them. So to kind of conclude, you can also try to keep outsmarting them. My wife and I, both master gardeners, and love our plants, don't like to use chemicals. We try to stay on top of the maintenance of the garden. We definitely rotate our crops so we don't follow tomatoes with tomatoes and so forth. And we sometimes install barriers. We try to find resistant varieties that are resistant to fungi and so forth. And we plant border areas with lots of flowers, because most of these parasites, the wasps in particular, have to feed on nectar like bees and to fuel their flight muscles. And so they're visiting flowers especially. And the predators live on plants as their substrates, and they're feeding on things besides the pests. So there's lots of things that you can do to discourage the bugs, try to outsmart them. And there's always a plan B. That is your extension office, the sponsor of this talk, of course. And Laura and Joanna are there, plus garden volunteers at desks at the farmer's market and the garden, botanical garden and so forth, that are able to answer your questions, or if not, get you connected with someone who can. In summary, remember that if you kill every insect, pull every weed, you may be not doing as much for the environment as you think you are, because most of the insects are actually helping us, and they're necessary to generate that food chain that I showed you. And if you eliminate them, then the creatures that are feeding on the upper parts of that food chain, the birds, for example, are going to suffer population declines because they are dependent. Now, granted, a lot of these are seed-eating birds and not insect eaters in this particular photo, but you got the idea. There are lots of things that are feeding on insects. So not just the charismatic ones, but every insect has a special role, a special part in the ecosystem, in the ecology. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and we'll try to answer questions. Balance is the key, and stability is a result of having a biodiverse habitat, not a sterile lawn. So I put this slide up, Laura. Is that where you want me to leave it?
Yeah, unless you need to hop back and forth and maybe visit another slide, we'll leave that up. So we'll get into questions. We have a good amount of time for questions, so perfect on your timing. I usually forget to go over this stuff, so I'm going to go over it really fast before we do questions. On here, you'll see joanna.wright@uga.edu if you did not register through like the Clark County registration for this webinar, no big deal, but I'd highly encourage you to send your email to that email address. If you do that, you'll both get an evaluation, which is incredibly helpful for us. I will remind everybody you'll get your evaluation re-emailed to you in the follow-up email, and if you could take 5 minutes, that'd be awesome. But also all of the resources we've been talking about and anything that we sort of has come up during the talk in those links and maybe some publications, we send all of that out through our follow-up email. So we won't have your email if you didn't register officially through Clark County. So you can, if you didn't register, shoot it there and we'll get you all your stuff. I also, Bob mentioned the Great Pollinator Census. This is a pretty new program in Georgia. I think last year was its pilot year. It went really well. It's a really fun activity to do in your own garden or going out and visiting a public space that you like that has plants and flowers. But you spend about 15 minutes and you just pick a plant and you look and see who all is visiting it. And there's tons of resources that we'll be sharing, and the botanical gardens and other extension offices will be sharing in the weeks leading up to that. That'll kind of teach you what some of the bugs are that you'll see and walk you through how to do that. There are activities for kids and stuff. So if you're a bug person or a teacher or whatever, I highly encourage you to look that up and kind of see if that's something you'd want to do or get some kids to participate in, or you yourself. And then I will plug our next Green Thumb lecture is going to be next month in August, and it's going to be on fall vegetable gardening. So kind of walking through tips and tricks and information about your fall vegetable garden so that you have time to get ready for that and kind of learn what you need to learn before it's among us and we're already in our fall vegetable garden. So that being said, I'll go ahead and touch on some of the questions that we didn't get to. Hold on, I'm having trouble with my little scroll. So first of all, I did want to say, because I don't think Bob can see the chat box, Linda wanted to say hello, and she's one of your wow bug teachers. I think she said she's going to be a master gardener. So she sent out a hello and a thank you. I'll go through. So we had a question back towards the beginning when you were talking about decomposers with the longhorn beetles. Do you know, do they feed on live trees? Can they cause damage to trees as well, or are they mostly decomposers?
Well, generally they're decomposers, but the notable exception, which we are not, maybe you have more recent information, but to my knowledge is not in Clark County, is the Asian ash borer, which is one of the longhorn beetles that attacks live ash trees and is capable of killing them, and has done a lot of damage to the ash trees in especially the northern parts of our country. And it is, I think, found in parts of Georgia, but I don't know if it's in Clark County.
I don't know of any in particular in Clark County, but we also, I don't know a lot of people that are doing timber and that have ash here, but we certainly have them in Georgia. I've heard some specialists give some interesting talks on that. But yeah, so the brown kind of native kind typically are decomposers.
Yeah, typically I would say they come in after the tree is dead. But as I say, that one is an exception, and there are a few others, I think, but that's the most notable. Typically, they're decomposers.
Okay, that's good to know. We had a question when we were talking about some of the different pollinators and all the many different types of bees. You'll commonly see the little pollinator habitat houses for sale at garden stores and hardware stores. Are those effective? Are those good things to put around your garden?
Absolutely. I have used them for years. I make them myself, just with my drill in a solid piece of wood or even a tree. But if you buy one, they're quite nice. Here's the thing: they were designed originally for the mason bee, which is a spring flying bee that it was widely sold as a pollinator bee. A lot of them only have one size of hole. And that's the biggest flaw in them, in my view, why I make my own. I use drill bits that start at 1/8 of an inch, then 3/16, then a quarter, then 5/16, and then a half. So that in a typical block of wood, I will have drilled holes to the depth of my drill bits, and the depth isn't critical. But the point is that bees come in all sizes. And if your house that you've bought has only one size of the hole, then you're getting only a small subset of those bees that could be using it. So to encourage even greater diversity, try to get some kinds that have multiple hole sizes.
Very cool. And I've seen those, and I've wondered, especially if there are multiple hole sizes encouraging different species, it doesn't matter. They'll all kind of inhabit right next to each other.
They will. They're quite happy being in tenement housing like that, and they'll nest side by side quite happily. The depth is not critical. They'll use the depth. The other thing to be aware of is that the only bees you're getting are those which typically nest in twigs, hollow twigs, like if you've done rosebush trimming and look at the trimmed ends, typically you'll see holes in the end. Those have been often made by a solitary bee because the rose is pithy and easy for it to excavate. But preformed cavities are used. But in addition to the bees, wasps, there are solitary wasps. A lot of the predatory wasps using them. And of course, they're beneficial insects as well. And most people don't appreciate that. That they're providing homes not only for the bees, but also for wasps. So it's a win-win situation in my view, and I strongly encourage people to deploy them. If you make your own, I find the best locations are corners of buildings or fences, places where, because they tend to hunt for these by flying up and along edges. And if they come to a corner, that kind of brings them in. But almost any place you put them, you're going to get some. And they'll nest, there'll be different species nesting through the season. I'd say the spring mason bees are only active in the spring, but in the summer, you've got a whole different suite of bees nesting. And then again, in the fall, some go through a second generation. They will reuse those nests. They get a little bit old. And finally, if they do reuse them, you probably want to clean them out. And if you've got replaceable holes, like some of them are using a kind of a straw, like a cardboard straw, because that's a common diameter. That's probably well-to-do replacements now and then. And the reason for that is twofold. They get fungus in if any of the materials decay and don't get eaten, say the larva dies or something. And the other thing is that these, just like the hornworm caterpillar, have their own set of predators and parasites that come in to get them. So you're not aware of them, but they're there. And after a while, there's one that my wild bug teacher will know it well, but the wild bug is one of the main ones that is a problem for twig nesting insects because it has gregarious development. And so out of one bee larva, you get 300 or 400 wild bugs, and then they all disperse all over that block of wood or that nest box and infest almost everything. And so you end up getting parasites and not the ones you're after. And the parasites build up over time, which is the reason to replace them with new in the spring or summer.
Okay.
So
yeah, I think you actually, you answered a lot of the follow-up questions in your explanation. So that's good.
Oh, good.
When we were in the Firefly kind of section, we had a question about the different types of lights. So for instance, maybe the lights in a jar or blinking lights, can those affect or negatively affect firefly populations in your yard or throw them off or anything like that?
I assume you're talking about the age-old kids thing of taking a jar around and capturing fireflies and watching them blink and light in the jar.
Well, like lights hung up around your house. Or
oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I do that. I definitely.
Yeah. You're probably not having any major impact. There's still enough males flying around out there that most females will signal to a flying male. They aren't going to be attracted to the jar. All you have in the jar are males, by the way.
Oh, yeah. So
population is not going to be seriously impacted because most of the females will find males that you haven't captured in the jar and get mated and lay their eggs in the soil and reproduce, and they'll be back next year. So I don't view it as a problem.
Good to know. When talking about pests like the cabbage worms, the imported cabbage worms and other cabbage pests, if you kill them and leave the bodies around and on your plants. Is there any evidence that that deters other ones?
Well, my answer is I don't know. I'm not aware of any evidence, but it's possible that there could be some chemical residue from a dead bug that is repellent to a female laying eggs, I suppose. I don't
Yeah, I
know.
don't know. I haven't read
The
any.
answer is I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, great. And then we had a question about a resource. So Diane asked about the Garden Insects of North America book publication. Are you familiar with that one, or is there a particular garden insects book that you like? There it is. Can everybody see that? That's it, right? The one with the cat.
That's it.
Yep. So,
Yeah, I keep it in hand, and it says it's the ultimate guide to backyard bugs. There's, there's more information in there than you probably want, but there is a lot. It's a good resource if you're wanting a book that you can thumb through, and there's lots of interesting reading. And of course, there's lots of insects covered that we don't deal with at all in Georgia. They may be pests elsewhere in the country, but it is a good book. Whitney Crenshaw. Nice job.
yeah, we've got that in the extension office too.
Yeah. And there are other books on garden insects. I mean, the old golden guides to insects, there used to be a golden guide to garden pests, I think, or to pest insects. And I don't know if it's still in print anymore. But yeah, but nowadays online is rapidly displacing a lot of this. We find it easier just to click.
Yeah. Yeah, online is great and it's less cumbersome and it's usually less expensive, but there's also some not great information out there.
Right.
So you just got to double check your sources.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the downside, of course.
We had a question about the Japanese beetles and milky spore, and if that, that biological control, if that is effective with them.
Extremely effective. And we have done it and noticed a big decline in the population, not in the year that you do it. Of course, the milky spore is a disease of the larvae down in the soil. So you put it out in little piles around your lawn and gardens, little piles of powder, and then it gets washed into the soil where it is picked up by the larvae. And it does dispatch them so you don't get adult beetles. Yes, I would, that's a nice natural control. It's another example. It's not an insect controlling another insect, but it is very effective on Japanese beetles. So, yes.
Okay. That is pretty much it in terms of what I wrote down during the presentation, and I tried to, I think, catch y'all's comments at the end. Does anybody else have any questions about the presentation, or even for myself or Joanna about future extension?
Or any general insect question?
So we have a question about sawtooth fly control on roses.
What to do for controlling it?
Yeah, and also a lot of these things we can write down and send you some resources and some follow-up if you guys.
Yeah, again, I would refer to the extension bulletin first and foremost there. It's not one that I have much familiarity with personally, so I've not had to deal with it.
Yeah, Kathy, if you'll you can put it privately or in the group chat. If you want to either email us or send me your email, we can do a follow-up response with you on that one and send you some more detailed information about it.
I could look in the book here, but I'm not going to do that while we're on.
Yeah, well, it's easier when we get an email. That way we can spend a minute and kind of give a detailed response. So we have a new gardener that is planning their garden. And what are some resources for finding pest-resistant plants so that she can set herself up for success, which is resistance is a great preliminary IPM, integrated pest management practice. So I think Bob knows this, but pest-resistant plants in terms of bugs and insects are harder to find than pathogen-resistant plants, but I don't know.
They are very much harder to find. And again, most of the seed companies, for example, in their catalogs feature and say if they are resistant varieties. And of course, there is a lot of research active every year on developing more resistant varieties. So I would look through seed catalogs and go online and get various seed companies to send you their seed catalog if you don't already have them. Once you get on the mailing list, you'll be on it forever.
Yeah. Yeah. And Rebecca, also, I would encourage you to either email, I'm not sure which county you're in, either myself or your local extension agent.
Certainly.
There's a lot of kind of cultural practices that you can use in terms of when you plant your plants or protective coverings.
My questions.
And those, depending on what plant you're planting, your extension agent can help you figure out some other things that'll help you kind of preempt your pest problem. Not like Bob had mentioned, the winter squash versus summer squash, or planting early, or putting up floating row covers during certain times of year. There's a lot of stuff that's specific to the crop that you're growing that you can work through.
I didn't mention companion planting, which is another popular practice of planting floral resources like, say, marigolds and zinnias and so forth right along the edge of your garden, interplanting them. That provides habitat for the good guys, and that can be very helpful to do. And again, biodiversity is again enhanced through companion planting like that.
Yeah, absolutely. See, we have several more. So let's see. Chris had a great question earlier that I forgot to ask. Once you see something eating a plant leaf, but you are not able to find the culprit of what's eating it, what are some other steps you could take? Maybe either ways to find them, or maybe identify more or less what it could be based on the damage.
Exactly. Yeah. If you take a photograph of the damage and then either go online and look at plant damage, if you say it's on your broccoli and you can say broccoli insect damage, chances are you'll find something that looks very similar as one approach. The other is to, again, plan B, go to the extension people and show them the damage. They may recognize it because it probably is something that others have had as well, and they may have dealt with it already.
Other things that other people are dealing with at the same time in the same place are great, effective resources. So Jim had a question: what are some effective ways to get rid of squash borers besides picking them off? Is there a way? I've had a lot of questions about squash stem borers because they're so terrible. But is there a way to? I know they lay their eggs in the soil and the larvae come out. Is there some way to prevent them? I know people have talked about putting like rolls around the stems to prevent them from getting to the stem.
Yeah, some people like aluminum foil. If you don't have a big garden and you can put that kind of effort in, that is fairly effective to mechanically prevent them access.
So just wrapping down to the base of the plant.
Yeah, and you don't have to wrap it real tight. You don't want to suffocate the plant, but that can help. And then, as you say, because once the larva gets into the stem, it's not very accessible to chemical controls. So you're trying to keep it from getting into the stem to start with.
Yeah.
Damage is done by the time you've seen it, typically, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's hard once you see it to do much about it. We had a question about the milky spore. Would you just quickly kind of reiterate for those of us who have never heard of it, what that is and how it's used on the Japanese beetle?
The milky spore?
Yes.
Well, I think it's a fungus.
Yeah, I believe so. And it just comes in a powder.
It comes as a powder, and the instructions are like every yard or so, put a small pile in the area that you have experienced or around the edge of the garden, or you can do it on a grid. Again, if you follow the directions and put the powder down, that's all there is to it. And you just, once you've done that, you've done everything you can do. The problem is any place you haven't treated, then they're likely to be developing. So that's the big problem, is you can't possibly treat every square inch of area where they're actually breeding. The grubs are breeding, but it certainly is effective if in the areas that you do treat.
We had a good question, kind of a follow-up to the squash stem borer, and we had a question of if there are any trap plants that attract the squash vine borer. And I guess I'll kind of quickly, what I've heard from a lot of our extension specialists when we have these conversations, I think, I don't know if it was Bob Westerfield or somebody else, but I've heard it a couple times. The recommendation here is just if you're going to plant summer squash, that you go ahead and plan on planting successionally. So it's almost like your own summer squash is the trap crop. I know Bob may have other response to that, but that you just, once you plant your summer squash, wait a week or two, plant another one that's going to be coming in behind it, because we have such a bad problem with them here that there's a
Yeah.
good likelihood that you'll lose.
And another thing that also could maybe speed up that process, because they root readily from the stem, is to bury the stem beyond where the damage is. And that should, if you've buried it and put a little water with it, it may well take root and continue going without having to start from a seedling.
Yeah, if you're able to dig that borer out of the stem, you can mound soil on top of where the damage is, and a lot of times the squash, like Bob was said, will put out new roots and it'll sort of start again from the damaged area.
Yeah, like, my squash, some of it, when it crawls along the ground and I say move the vine or something, I discovered that it's already sent down roots at the leaf node areas in many places.
Yeah, they kind of like
Very prone to do that.
It's moist, yeah. So Pat mentioned that she planted her squash in straw bales for the past 5 years and hasn't seen issues with the borer. So that's probably to do with the adult moth just doesn't find that an attractive place to lay their eggs or burrow or something. So yeah, there's probably a lot of interesting ways to deal with it.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting
I
tip.
haven't heard that before. That's very cool.
Does she let the bales age for a while before she uses them, or how does that matter?
Yeah, Pat, are you planting into fresh bales and then letting them decompose, or do you usually have aged decomposed bales that you plant into? We'll let her respond and I'll move on to another one.
Right.
So we have some ideas for another topic, which we'll take note of. Have you had any luck or heard of anybody having luck with peppermint oil on plants to discourage squash borers?
I am not personally familiar with it, and I've not tried it. I have heard of it, and it might work.
Similarly, sort of, I guess, not physical, but chemical barrier. I guess you would put it around the stem and just hope that they don't want to bore through that. It's deterrent to them to bore through that.
Yeah, I think what it does is it confuses their odor receptors, and they may not recognize it as a potential host plant.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I mean, I think we're caught up. We have a couple more minutes, then we'll let Bob go. Got a lot of great thank yous. And
well, this is great fun for me.
Yeah, well, we loved having you, so we'll definitely have you back. So remember, everybody, if there was something that you liked or didn't like, we'd love to hear about it. We're constantly tweaking our presentations and how we offer them and what we're offering. So feel free in your email evaluation to let us know what you'd like to hear more of and how we can improve. So thank you guys all so much for joining us. Look out for the follow-up email. And if you don't get it and you wanted it, just email myself or Joanna, whose email is up there on the screen. And you guys have a great evening. Thanks.
Great.
Bob.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Bob. That was great.